17 things about Tenochtitlan that sound impossible but are true. In the year 1325, a group of homeless migrants with no land of their own stood in the middle of a lake and decided to build a city there, not beside the lake. In it, what they built would grow into one of the largest cities on Earth, larger than most of Europe, more organized than London, more fed than Paris, and less than 200 years later, it was gone. Conquered in 93 days. Everything I'm about to tell you is documented, verified, real, not legend, not exaggeration, just facts that sound too strange to be true, pulled directly from the historical record and the accounts of people who were actually there. If this is your first time here, subscribe now, because there are 16 more of these waiting for you, and the last one explains exactly how an empire this powerful fell apart so fast. Let's start at the beginning. Number 1. An eagle decided where a city would stand. The Mexica people had been wandering for generations, expelled from every territory they tried to settle. They came originally from a place called Aztlan, somewhere to the north, though its exact location is still debated by historians today. Every powerful city-state around Lake Texcoco rejected them. They were considered outsiders, unwanted, disposable. Their priests told them to look for a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. A vision tied to their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, who had promised them a homeland if they kept faith through the wandering. In 1325, on a small, swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they saw it, exactly as described. That spot, mosquito-infested, half-submerged, claimed by nobody because nobody else wanted it, became the foundation of Tenochtitlan. Say it, Tenochtitlan. The name combines Tetl, meaning stone, Nochtli, meaning prickly pear cactus, and Tlan, meaning place. The place of the stone cactus. Nobody wanted that island. That's exactly why the Mexica got to keep it, without a fight. Within just a few decades of that first landing, the same people who had once been turned away from every shoreline around the lake were building causeways, dredging canals, and laying the first foundations of temples on ground that had been open water within living memory. Number 2. The city had more people than any city in Europe. By the early 1400s, less than 100 years after that first landing, Tenochtitlan's population had grown past 200,000 people. London, at the same time, roughly 50,000. Paris, around 60,000. Tenochtitlan had more residents than both of those cities combined, sitting on an island most geographers today would call unbuildable. This wasn't a slow accumulation over centuries. This was explosive growth, built by a society that had arrived as refugees a few generations earlier and turned a rejected swamp into the most populated city in the Western Hemisphere. To put it in even sharper perspective, Tenochtitlan in this period likely held more people than every city in England combined. An island that had been considered worthless real estate had become more densely populated than entire countries across the ocean. Number 3. They built farmland on top of water. Solid ground was scarce on the island. There simply wasn't enough space to feed 200,000 people through conventional farming. So the Mexica invented something extraordinary, chinampas. Say it, chinampas. These were rectangular plots woven from reeds and branches, anchored to the shallow lake bed with wooden stakes, then layered repeatedly with mud and decomposing vegetation until the surface became solid, fertile soil, floating but stable enough to walk on and farm. These weren't small garden experiments. Chinampas eventually covered thousands of acres around the city, producing multiple harvests a year of corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, and tomatoes. Canals ran between the plots, allowing canoes to move produce directly to market. A city built in a lake fed itself by farming the lake. and it worked well, enough to sustain one of the largest urban populations on the planet. Number 4. The city had running drinking water. The lake surrounding Tenochtitlan was largely brackish, too salty and contaminated to drink safely in large quantities. So engineers built an aqueduct, carrying fresh water from natural springs near Chapultepec directly into the city, across the open lake, on raised stone channels. While much of medieval Europe drank from rivers and wells frequently, contaminated by waste and disease, Tenochtitlan's residents had a dedicated freshwater supply system, engineered specifically to bypass the undrinkable water surrounding them on every side. A city floating on water it couldn't drink, built a way to drink anyway. And they maintained that system for generations, with engineers performing regular repairs and even rerouting sections of the aqueduct when leaks or damage threatened the supply. Infrastructure maintenance most European cities of the same period had no equivalent system for. Number 5. The empire wasn't built by one city alone. Tenochtitlan didn't conquer central Mexico by itself. In 1424-8, it formed the Triple Alliance with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. Say them Texcoco and Tlacopan. On paper, the three were equal partners, splitting conquered territory and collected tribute according to an agreed formula. In practice, Tenochtitlan slowly became the dominant member, using the alliance's combined military strength to expand its own influence while keeping just enough of the original power-sharing arrangement intact to avoid open rebellion from its own allies. The exact moment that balance tipped isn't recorded anywhere. There's no treaty, no declaration, no clear date when Tenochtitlan stopped being an equal partner and became the empire's true center of gravity, an alliance of equals that quietly stopped being equal, and nobody alive today can say exactly when that happened. By the final decades of the empire, Texcoco and Tlacopan still received their agreed share of tribute, still sent troops when called, and still carried the formal title of allies. But the throne in Tenochtitlan made the decisions that mattered, and everyone in the alliance understood that without anyone ever having to say it directly. Number 6. One man rewrote history to make the Mexica look destined for greatness. A statesman named Tlacaelel, say it, Tlacaelel, served as a senior advisor across multiple reigns throughout the 1400s. He never held the title of emperor himself, but his influence shaped the empire's ideology more than almost anyone else in its history. He's credited with something remarkable and unsettling, ordering the burning of earlier historical records and replacing them with a new official narrative, one that positioned the Mexica as a chosen people, fated by the gods for greatness. With their rise tied directly to the sun, god Huitzilopochtli. We don't know exactly how much of pre-Tlacaelel Mexica history has been permanently lost to that decision. What we do know is that the version of history we have access to today was deliberately curated by a man with a clear political agenda, designed to justify expansion, warfare, and the Jew ad Stein Police. Empire's growing demand for tribute and sacrificial captives. History, even ancient history, isn't always simply what happened. Sometimes it's what someone in power decided should be remembered. Tlacaelel's version of events became the foundation for almost everything later. Generations, including the Spanish chroniclers, who arrived 2 centuries afterward, would come to understand as Mexica history. Number 7. Society was rigidly divided, but more fluid than you'd expect at the top of Mexica society. Nobles, priests, and military elites who controlled land, ceremony, and political authority. At the bottom, commoners called misihuales, who farmed the chinampas, built the temples, and formed the backbone of the labor force. In between, merchants called pocteca, who held surprising economic and political power, and who sometimes operated as informal spies for the state during their long, distance trading expeditions into foreign territory. Status in this system wasn't entirely fixed at birth. A commoner who captured enough enemy warriors in battle could be elevated into the warrior elite, gaining land, privileges, and social standing that would otherwise have been completely unreachable. Military success was essentially one of the only paths available that let someone climb out of the class they were born into. This meant the empire's constant warfare wasn't just about tribute and territory. It was also the primary engine of social mobility for thousands of young men across the empire, which helps explain why military campaigns remained so relentless even during years when the empire's territory was already enormous and tribute income was already substantial. War wasn't only policy. It was the one door that stayed open for an entire society. Number 8. The market at Tlatelolco may have been the largest in the world. Spanish soldiers who saw it firsthand, including chroniclers traveling with Cortés, described a marketplace so vast and so meticulously organized that they compared it favorably to anything they had seen in Europe, including Rome and Constantinople, two of the largest cities they knew. Tens of thousands of people moved through the Tlatelolco market daily. Vendors sold raw gold, polished jade, cacao beans used as a form of currency, exotic feathers from tropical birds, slaves, prepared food, medicinal herbs, and finished tools, all organized into specific designated sections enforced by market officials who patrolled the rows checking for fraud, short measures, and stolen goods. A market with its own internal police force and currency system, operating in a city that most of Europe didn't even know existed. Some estimates drawn from Spanish accounts suggest the market handled more daily transactions than any single marketplace in Europe at the time, with goods arriving from regions hundreds of miles away, carried by porters and traders along roads and canals that connected the capital to the far edges of the empire. Number 9. The Templo Mayor was dedicated to two gods at once. The central pyramid of the city held twin shrines at its summit. One dedicated to Tlaloc, god of rain and agricultural fertility, and one to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun. That pairing wasn't accidental. It fused the two forces the empire depended on most for survival, successful harvests and successful military conquest, into a single sacred structure positioned at the exact ceremonial center of the city. Every major renovation of the temple made it physically larger, built directly on top of the previous version, layer after layer, like rings inside a tree trunk. Archaeologists have since identified at least 7 distinct construction phases buried inside the structure, each one telling its own chapter of the empire's expanding ambition, with the largest expansions occurring during the reigns when military success and tribute income reached their highest points. Number 10. A flood in 1446 nearly destroyed everything. They'd built Lake Texcoco rose catastrophically that year, drowning entire fields of chinampas, collapsing homes built along the canals, and triggering a severe famine that took years to fully recover from. The flood didn't just damage physical infrastructure, it damaged the city's underlying confidence in its own control over the environment. In a place where the entire food supply depended on a delicate, carefully engineered relationship with water that could be undone by a single bad season. Number 11. A 5-year drought followed less than a decade later. Between 1450 and 1455, the region was hit by severe, sustained droughts combined with crop-killing frosts. Multiple consecutive years of agricultural failure layered directly on top of the recovery from the earlier flood. Surviving sources describe desperate measures taken during this period, families selling their own children into servitude in exchange for food to survive, entire communities abandoning farmland that could no longer produce, and a documented sharp increase in human sacrifices. which the Ifan Elsan Sign Bien Suen Shin Hishan and Nowuf priesthood believed were necessary to restore the favor of the gods who controlled rain, fertility, and the harvest cycle. A city that had engineered floating farmland still couldn't out-engineer the sky. When the climate turned against them, all that brilliant infrastructure bought them time, but not immunity. Tribute demands on conquered territories often increased during these crisis years, as the capital tried to compensate for its own agricultural shortfalls by extracting more food and resources from the regions it controlled. A pattern that quietly deepened resentment in exactly the places the empire would later need loyalty from most. Number 12. Tenochtitlan had one enemy it never managed to conquer, surrounded almost entirely by tributary states and defeated rivals who had been absorbed into the empire's system of tribute. One nation stood apart, Tlaxcala. Say it, Tlaxcala. Despite repeated military campaigns across multiple generations, the Mexica never fully subdued it. Some historians believe the empire deliberately left Tlaxcala independent, on purpose, rather than by simple failure, using periodic ritual battles against them known as flower wars, to train young warriors and capture prisoners destined for sacrifice, without ever committing to the cost of full annexation and occupation. Other historians reject this entirely, arguing Tlaxcala simply fought too well and too consistently to be defeated by force, and that the empire settled for blockade and containment instead, cutting off trade goods like cotton and salt rather than risking further losses, whether by genuine military failure or calculated long-term strategy. One undefeated enemy sat right at the edge of the empire for generations, nursing a deep and lasting resentment. And that enemy was still there, fully intact, when the Spanish finally arrived on the coast. Number 13. The empire's own enemies built the bridge for its destruction when Hernán Cortés landed in 1519 with a few hundred men, a handful of horses, and limited supplies. He shouldn't have stood any real chance against an empire commanding the loyalty of millions of people across central Mexico, an empire that, on paper, could have crushed his expedition within days. He didn't need to win alone. Tlaxcala, the nation Tenochtitlan had spent generations trying and failing to conquer, allied with him almost, immediately supplying thousands of experienced warriors who knew the local terrain, understood the regional languages, and carried decades of accumulated resentment toward Mexica domination and tribute demands. Without that alliance, historians widely agree the conquest would have been militarily impossible for such a small Spanish force. Cortés understood this almost immediately upon making contact, and he moved deliberately to secure Tlaxcala's loyalty before ever marching toward the capital, recognizing that local resentment toward Mexica rule was a weapon more powerful than anything his own soldiers carried. Number 14. A disease nobody had ever seen killed faster than any army. Smallpox arrived with the Spanish in 1520, spreading rapidly through a population with zero biological immunity to the virus. Entire neighborhoods died within weeks of the first cases appearing. Historians estimate the epidemic killed a substantial share of Tenochtitlan's population, including the Emperor Cuitlahuac, say it, Cuitlahuac, who had only just taken the throne after the death of his predecessor, and who died of the disease himself within months of becoming ruler. An invisible enemy that nobody could see, fight, or negotiate with did more damage to the empire in a matter of months than years of conventional warfare had ever managed to accomplish. By the time the final siege began, the city's defenders weren't just exhausted from combat. They were weakened, grieving, and operating at a fraction of their pre-epidemic strength. Number 15. The city's own water system was used to starve it. During the final siege of the city, Spanish forces and their indigenous allies systematically cut the aqueduct, carrying fresh water from Chapultepec. and blockaded the raised causeways connecting the island to the surrounding mainland. The same sophisticated engineering that had made Tenochtitlan a marvel of the ancient world. Its strategic isolation on open water, its dependence on carefully controlled supply lines for food and fresh water, became the exact structural weakness used to slowly strangle the city into submission. The siege ground on for weeks, with starvation and thirst doing as much damage inside the walls as the fighting happening at the 5 causeways. Number 16. The final emperor was captured trying to escape by canoe. Cuauhtémoc, say it, Cuauhtémoc, took the throne as the empire was already collapsing around him, leading the final resistance through the last brutal weeks of the siege as food, water, and fighters all ran out simultaneously. When the city had nothing left to defend itself with, he attempted to flee across the lake by canoe, likely hoping to regroup forces elsewhere and continue the resistance from a safer position. He was captured before he could escape. The city fell completely on August 13th, 1521, exactly 93 days after the final siege began. Cuauhtémoc would later be tortured by the Spanish in an attempt to force him to reveal the location of hidden imperial treasure, and was eventually executed years afterward. The last ruler of an empire that no longer existed. The most engineered, most densely populated, most administratively sophisticated city the Americas had ever produced was taken in less time than a single agricultural growing season. Number 17. The city you live near today might be built on top of it. After the conquest, the major temples were systematically dismantled, and the new colonial capital, Mexico City, was constructed directly on top of Tenochtitlan's ruins using much of the same stone. The Templo Mayor itself sat buried and completely forgotten beneath layers of colonial streets and buildings for nearly 400 years, rediscovered almost entirely by accident in 1978, when utility workers digging routine trenches struck a massive carved stone disc just below the surface. One of the largest cities on Earth today, Mexico City, now home to more than 20 million people, sits directly on top of the lake city that came before it, layer upon layer, the same way the Templo Mayor itself was once built. Streets, subway tunnels, and building foundations across the historic center of the modern capital have all, at different points, uncovered fragments of the empire that supposedly ended in 1521. The city beneath the city has never fully stopped surfacing. So how did homeless migrants with no land of their own build the largest city the Americas had ever seen, and then lose all of it in just 90 free ply? 3 days? The answer was never just one single cause. It's all 17 of these, stacked together, reinforcing each other. Brilliant engineering that created deep dependency on a fragile, easily disrupted lake system. An alliance built on a hidden, unequal balance of power that nobody ever fully addressed. One enemy left unconquered for generations, who eventually opened the door for everyone else to walk through. And a disease that arrived faster than any army, faster than any defense could possibly be organized against it. The same ingenuity that built a floating city out of a rejected swamp is exactly what made its collapse so fast, once the right combination of pressure was finally applied from every direction at once. Military, biological, environmental, and political, all converging in the same 93 days. 17 things most people never learn about a city that no longer exists, sitting directly beneath one that does. And if a story like this, a golden age built on impossible engineering, and a fall just as fast, caught your attention, I told a story just like it in my last video. A city of knowledge and wealth that took 500 years to build and 13 days to lose. Go watch what happened in Baghdad next.